Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're seeing me for the first time, this is Santosh Potraju. Today we are in a Kafka tutorial playlist. If you missed the earlier videos, I highly recommend watching starting from the beginning of the playlist. But today we are going to talk about consumer internals. So if you're interested in only knowing about consumer internals, this is perfectly alright. But if you watch the at least the Kafka terminology, you will better understand what we are going to discuss in this video. With that said, let's get started with our video. Okay, so as we already gone through few videos in this particular playlist, we already spoke about the Kafka architecture, and in the last video, we spoke about Kafka partitions, replications, high availability, fault tolerance, and also we covered a few things about producer internals, right? So something similar to the producer internals, in this video, we are going to cover consumer internals. And with respect to the consumer internals, we are going to talk about three core concepts, which is polling, offset management, and rebalancing. So these three topics we are going to discuss. Just like a normal video, every single video, we are going to use a blackboard, and here we are going to describe with some conceptual ideas. Okay, so if you watch the earlier video, which is producer internals, you might aware of what these boxes are. But just to recap, these boxes are representing the partitions. And for example, within the topic post, let's assume that we have three partitions. We have P0, P1, and P2, right? So since we have three partitions, as we discussed in the Kafka terminology, it is possible to have three consumers, right? So since we have three partitions here, let's assume that here I have one consumer group, and within this consumer group, let's consider that we have three consumers, and each consumer is going to read the data from the designated partitions. For example, here the consumer 0 is reading data from a P0, and here the consumer 1 is reading data from P1, and here the consumer 2 is reading the data from this particular P2 partition. Let's assume that, for example. And within this consumer, all these consumers are doing the same thing. So even though these are reading from different partitions, eventually the data set is same. So as we know, the similar type of data is writing into the same Kafka topic, right? So the data is very similar. What that means is the schema is same, or the type of data we are receiving into all these partitions are the same. Okay, so very first thing, the polling option. So how consumers are going to read the data from all these partitions? So consumers are going to poll continuously on all these partitions by looking at the new set of data. For example, let's bring this particular partition outside, and let's assume that this is the partition, and within the partition, as we know, we will have the messages. For example, here I have M0, M1, M2, M3, and 4. For example, I have 4 messages in this particular partition, right? So here, this C2 is going to read the messages from this particular partition, right? Of the P2 partition, right? So continuously, this consumer is going to send polling to the Kafka environment. So what that means is continuously it will look for the new set of data. So in that way, when consumer is trying to connect to the Kafka partition, then Kafka is also considering this consumer as still alive. For example, if I define like a polling interval equals to 30 seconds, every time this consumer is going to send message to here, if that is within the 30 seconds, then consumer think like okay, this consumer is alive. For any reason, if this particular consumer didn't send any polling request to this particular Kafka environment within the 30 seconds, then this particular Kafka environment consider the C2 as dead, and eventually the rebalancing will happen. But before we go into the rebalancing, I just want to cover the polling and offset management. Then after we will talk about the rebalancing. There is a small clause, but we will get to know that. Okay, so as we know, the polling is very important in the consumer side, because by using the polling, this consumer is going to look for the messages continuously on the Kafka partitions. And in this way, the Kafka is going to treat the consumer whether alive or dead. Okay, so now we know what is the polling. Let's talk about offset management, right? As we know, in the Kafka, offset means indexing. So every message, for example, here we have M0 message, right? So the offset value for the M0 is 1, and this is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is the offset value. So if you watch the Kafka terminology, we spoke about the offset management, I mean, the offset value very, very clearly. But here, as we know, this particular M0 message is sitting at a 0th location. And here M1 is sitting at a first location, M2 is sitting at second location, M3 at 3, M4 at a fourth location, right? So when consumer is reading this particular M0 message, let's assume that we don't have M1, M2, M3, and M4 by the time of reading M0 message. And this particular C2 read the M0 message. And in the next 30 seconds, when this consumer sent another polling to the Kafka partition, by the time maybe we will have the M1 value here. But how this consumer is going to know, I already read M0 value, now it's time to read the M1 value. That's where the offset management become like a very, very crucial. So within the offset management, we have two categories. One is auto offset, and the second one is a manual offset. So offset management is nothing but just keep track of what messages already read by the consumer, and in the next polling, what message it has to read. So here in the auto offset management, Kafka is going to handle the offset management, meaning Kafka is going to have some other internal topics, and within the internal topics, Kafka is going to keep track of what messages already read by this particular consumer, and in the next polling, what message it has to start. So here in the manual offset, instead of we let that option to the Kafka environment, now we are going to keep track of what messages read by this particular consumer group, and in the next polling, what messages I have to start reading from. And this manual offset, this is really important if we need to do some post logic, meaning, for example, let's consider this one, right? For example, when C2 is reading some messages from this particular partition 2, while reading all these messages, for example, here I read the M0 value. While I am processing the M0 value, meaning maybe I have to drop all these messages into the Elasticsearch, while I am dropping that message into the Elasticsearch, maybe something went wrong to this particular Kafka consumer. So what that means is that this particular pod or this particular process is dead, right? So but when it comes to the auto offset value, Kafka will treat like this particular value or this particular message already read by the consumer too. But in reality, this particular value is not yet dropped into the Elasticsearch, right? So that's where we are going to use the manual offset. For example, if instead of we let that option to the Kafka environment, if I start working on managing the offset value, for example, in this flow, after reading the M0 value, the next job is dropping that message into the Elasticsearch. So right after dropping into the Elasticsearch, now this Kafka consumer is going to update the offset value by saying I read the message at the offset value equals to the 0. So during this process, for example, if Kafka, this particular consumer did during dropping into the Elasticsearch, even though this is dropped in the next consumer, whatever the consumer I am going to read the messages, since the value is not updated on the offset management side, the next consumer will still read the M0 value, and then it will start processing into dropping into the Elasticsearch. Then after it will update the value here. So here, let's say offset value set to the 0. In the next time, in the next polling, this particular C2, which is consumer 2, will start reading messages from the M1 value. So if we really need to do some post processing, and if we need to have the high data accuracy, then choosing the manual offset is going to risky our life. But if we are looking for the simple process, even though missing one or two events out of thousands or millions of the records, if that is not a big deal, we can also choose the auto offset value. So it depends on use case to use case, depends on your use case. You can pick whether auto offset management or you can pick pick the manual offset management. So when we are going to write some programs for the consumer, during that time we can experiment or we can instrument with the auto offset values and manual offset values. But in theory, for the offset value, we have two options. One is auto offset, and the second one is a manual offset. Okay, now let's talk about a rebalancing, right? So for example, this particular C2 is dead during processing that particular event, right? So right after the C2 is dead, when Kafka is considered like a C2 is dead, now within this consumer group, the rebalancing will happen. What that means is, in this particular consumer group, we still have two more consumers. And instead of waiting for this particular consumer, these two consumers are going to read messages from P2 partition, and also these two will share load reading from P1 partition and also P0 partition. So that is called the rebalancing concept. So when rebalance happened, whenever we have one consumer dead within the consumer group, some other consumers in the same consumer group, they will start reading, they will start sharing the load. Meaning within this particular consumer group, we have three consumers which are reading the data from three partitions. If C2 is there, now C0 and C1 are going to read messages from all these three partitions. Once C2 is came online, and now the C2 is also going to join the consumer group, and then based on the offset management, meaning based on the offset value, now C2 is also going to read the messages from particular those partitions. So that's what it is. I hope the concepts are very clear. So just to recap, within the consumer, we spoke about what is polling, and we also talked about what is offset value management, and also we spoke about rebalancing. In the next video, we are going to talk about the deployment strategies. To be honest, the deployment strategies is one of my favorite topics, but I will try to give the conceptual idea. And once we complete the deployment strategy, moving forward, we are going to spend a lot of time on the installation, and this will be the interesting area for most of the people, like how we can set up the environment, and how we can set up the Kafka cluster, and how we can deploy it, and those type of details we are going to start covering from the fifth chapter. But yeah, so in the next video, we are going to talk about deployment strategies very, very quickly. Then after, we will go into the Kafka installation. I hope you guys like this video. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe, and also share this video with your friends. Okay, thank you so much, and see you in the next video. Bye.